maybe
This meeting is being recorded.
a little bit of explanation, very brief note of explanation. See, what I'm trying to do through this course is not to give you definitive interpretations of biblical texts. That's not what I'm trying to do. My aim, if at all I succeed in achieving that aim by God's grace, my aim is to provide some tools of thought with which you can undertake your own explorations of biblical texts. If I may put the difference in a slightly different way, it's the difference between giving somebody 10 or 100 fishes on the one hand and teaching that person to fish. Which is better? So I'm not trying to supply fish. I'm only trying to say perhaps you could catch fish in this manner. Okay? So I wish I could see all of you because I find it very difficult to speak without seeing human faces. So as far as possible, try to stay on visually, keep the video on. All right. Now, I'm not going to recapitulate what was said last Saturday for the reason that the entire recording was available to you, and therefore we can economize on time by not recapitulating. But I'm going to continue from there and to take our thoughts a little further afield. Today, let's begin with a question arising out of what Jesus taught. He said, seek. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Ask and you shall receive. Seek and you shall find. Knock and the door will be open to you. It's a very familiar text. Matthew chapter 7, verse 7. Now, why is seeking such a crucial or basic or essential spiritual responsibility? I feel we need to become aware of this because what usually happens is that we listen. Listening is a very good thing. I'm not saying that we should not listen. We are used to, accustomed to listening all the time. In the process, we tend to forget that the people we are listening to are the people who took the advice of Jesus seriously insofar as they sought. Because they sought, they found. And because they found, they have something to share. Okay? So, the idea in seeking is to be able to find in order to share. I get some feedback from my microphone. If you could please switch it off. Thank you very much. So, that is the yardstick of our spiritual progress in the sense that from being listeners and receivers, we gradually grow to a position wherein we also become providers. Now, this pattern is very evident in the life of Jesus Christ. For example, he called the 12, and the Bible says he called them to himself. I'm referring to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verse 14. He called them to himself, right? Now, obviously, when he called them to himself, he expected them to listen to him. So we find him teaching the ones he called. But then his way of teaching was not merely confined to giving them some sermons. Actually, the Sermon on the Mountain was not given by Jesus in the way, or in the shape or order in which it is found in the two Gospels. They have been put together. Jesus' way of teaching his disciples was what we might call, for want of better expression, hands-on. Make them participate in an actual ministry, make them encounter life situations, make them face problems, expose them to human realities, the human condition in all its multifaceted challenges, and sometimes push them to the edge, as in the case of their sailing on Galilee, when Peter feels that the boat in which they're traveling could capsize and they could all perish upon the instant. And then through it all, teach them. And I believe that's the right way to teach. Anyway, let me now stick to the original pattern. Namely, Jesus called his disciples to himself that they may learn of him in this kind of holistic way of teaching. I wish some policymakers in education in India studies this so that generations of students can benefit from it. I used to conduct orientation programs for teachers. I've done that in almost every state in this country. And there was one unit that I repeated for all groups I have ever addressed. And that is Jesus the teacher. And I used to share with the mainly school teachers some of the fundamentals, some of the most basic characteristics or aspects of Jesus's way of teaching people. So, and Jesus expected his disciples to listen to him, but then, after having said "come," he says something else. What does he say? Go, right? Go. Two words complete the picture: come and go. Right? So, how does Matthew's gospel end? Go and make disciples of all nations, right? Go. Now, this is what is called dynamism. And dynamism always refers to human growth. My dear friends, we cannot grow in passivity. If you get stuck in inertia, in the passive, in what is also in more attractive terminology called comfort zone, your comfort zone is mostly a domain of inertia. You will never grow. So in that state, there's only one word: come. Come and rest here. So we are very happy to quote the 46th Psalm, God is my refuge, right? It's like a hotel room, a comfortable 5-star hotel room. God is a comfortable room, refuge, right? But there is another side to this. God also says, go. So you find in the 10th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, Jesus sending his disciples out. So coming is incomplete without going. Okay? It's an important pattern. Now, the thing is, it is between the two terminals of coming and going that our spiritual wholeness, our spiritual vitality lies. If I may use an empirical analogy, all analogies are limited, okay? We have to, when it comes to spiritual matters, we must understand that all material or empirical analogies are very severely limited. With that as a caveat, let me say this. This is somewhat like the positive and negative terminals of a battery. Will there be a flow of current if only one of the two terminals is present? Absolutely not. You may have the most powerful, most expensive battery in the world, but it will be of no use if the two terminals are not in dynamic connection or communion with each other. The same principle applies to our spiritual life. God calls us, Jesus calls us to himself, but then in that calling, something else is already implied, and that is go. So come and go. And that's the reason I thought I would do this course with you, and it is not a well-prepared course. It's not a structured course. It's a course that will develop itself as we move along. So then, I was trying to strike a general note in emphasizing the importance of maintaining a seeking attitude to all that we would share. Now, when I say seeking attitude, it also means the willingness to be disturbed from where you are lodged. See, unfortunately, because of this kind of drumming in all the time that has happened in our religious nurture, that you should not deviate from where you are, our idea of staying faithful is actually no more than the idea of excluding seeking from our spiritual life or religious life. That's exactly our idea of being faithful. Whereas Jesus lays tremendous importance or emphasis on seeking. And I'm trying to sort of explain why this is important and why the seeking attitude is basic to all that we are going to do from now onwards. In other words, my own approach to this will be that through administering this course, I am also seeking with you. So your participation in every bit of what we discuss, your questioning, your disagreement, your unhappiness, whatever it be, will enable us to seek better. Okay? That's the first thing I want to do. The second thing is, well, maybe I should say a little more about the importance of seeking. Now, all of us are familiar with the teachings of Mahatma Gandhi. We know that Gandhi was fascinated by the hand, right? Gandhi once said that if he were a poet, he would have written an epic on the hand. Now, Gandhi's fascination with the hand had many facets, but the main aspect was the spiritual importance that he attached to work. So Gandhi established ashrams. What are ashrams? The root of the word ashram is shram, which is a Sanskrit root for work, shram. Okay? Parisramam, sramikiga, work. Okay? Srama, ashram. Ashram is a place where people live together and work together. You can't be in an ashram and lazy. You can't be a parasite in an ashram. And also, in Gandhi's idea of ashram, you cannot be an inmate in an ashram if you are not willing to grow. Do you know that Gandhi made it mandatory for the inmates of his ashram in South Africa, particularly the Phoenix settlement in South Africa, to learn at least 2 more languages? Every inmate had to, besides his or her mother tongue, learn 2 more languages. Gandhi taught 2 languages to the inmates of the Phoenix settlement. And it would surprise you to know that he taught Tamil and Urdu. Why? Because he did not know Tamil and Urdu. that was that was his way of learning Tamil and Urdu. He taught them. So his idea of being in an ashram had many aspects. One, of course, as I said, is work culture, dignity of labor, which sometimes landed him in trouble with his own wife, Kasturba. We are aware of these details. I won't repeat them. But something that is not often mentioned is what I need to underline, namely, that the willingness to grow was fundamental to being an inmate in an ashram. And I believe that that is very spiritual. As we go along, we'll have a great deal to discover about the spirituality of growth and the spirituality of fullness of life. But that's on a future occasion. Now, I refer to Gandhiji's fascination with the hand for a reason. Now, if you look at your hand, what do you find? You find 5 fingers, right? Each hand has 5 fingers. How many senses do we have? We have 5 senses, right? Yeah. And our entire relationship, our total contact with this massive universe is only through the 5 senses. It's a very fascinating thing. Now, this is a tremendously fascinating thing. It's a world of amazement and wonder. It's far beyond our comprehension. But the only way we can relate to this enchanting, bewildering, almost cosmic world is through our 5 senses. Now, having registered that at the back of your mind, again, look at your hand. You have 5 fingers, but between the 5 fingers, there are gaps, right? Somebody's microphone is nagging me. Could you please switch it off? I request. Kunya, somebody has. Kunya, you will have to switch off everybody's audio. This is very, very, very disturbing. I was saying that just as there are gaps between our fingers, there are gaps between our senses. So when we relate to the world through our 5 senses, what happens? We will never be able to relate to the external world in its totality. There will always be gaps. And being aware of this, we have to make a very special effort, a conscious effort, to provide the connectivities. If you don't provide the connectivities, what will happen? You will latch on to a small part and say, well, that is the world for me. This is how all the quarrels happen in the world. Look at Christendom. Thousands of denominations. Each denomination holding on to a small little thing and insisting that that is the total spiritual cosmos. Now, I am not against diversity. In fact, I am someone who celebrates diversity, plurality. But even as we celebrate diversity, we must realize that diversity can exist only if there is unity. That's why we talk about unity in diversity. Remove unity from diversity, what you get is chaos, anarchy. And in this world of bewildering diversity, I have to take 1 minute off you. I said I'm taking a class. I'll call you back as soon as I'm free. Okay? I'll call you back after an hour or so. Bye. All right. So I was saying that we must make a conscious effort to provide the connectivities so that our perception of reality does not become petty, infantile, silly, partial. It's pathetic, actually. Now, particularly in this culture of super specialization, super specialization, as most of you would know, specialization is defined as knowing more and more about less and less. Knowing more and more about less and less. So
Less and less.
actually, one who specializes must also be a generalist. And you see that beautifully in the life of Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein is very different from the scientists of our times. He was also a philosopher. In fact, he said emphatically that no one can be a scientist without being a philosopher. Now, who is a philosopher? A philosopher is one who tries to understand everything in relation to the whole. So there is one thing that spirituality shares in common with philosophy. And this is something I plead with you to remember and understand. There is a beautiful point of contact between philosophy and spirituality. And what is that? That's what Jesus said. Wholeness, completeness. Life in its wholeness. That is both spiritual and philosophical. Now, if you try to look for the wholeness of your life and understand it, you will become a profound philosopher. You will also be spiritually sound. Okay? On the other hand, we think that somehow a great advantage only to have a small part of everything. You see, my children, I've got two daughters, as you know, when they were little children, we used to make fried rice at home. And they used to be excited. But my children would take a plate of chicken fried rice and pick only the meat pieces. They will cherry pick the meat pieces and leave the rest. Until, of course, we train them otherwise. And though we are adults, when it comes to intellectual matters, religious matters, ideological matters, political things, or even social issues, we are experts. We are super specialists. We only see a small part. And we say, well, there's nothing more to it. Okay? I'm just requesting you to be aware of this. And that is the reason why it's a spiritual duty to seek. Now, seeking is the exercise, the spirituality of seeking is the discipline of connecting any given thing to the totality of the situation. And the totality of the situation includes not only the visible, not only the immediate, but also the invisible and the ultimate. So sometimes I define spirituality as the discipline of connecting the intimate with the ultimate, the local with the global, the personal with the general. Okay? For example, in the 13th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, I think it's verse 31, 32, 33, Jesus gives the parable of the mustard seed. Okay? So it's easy for us to think through what's familiar. Now, the mustard seed is something very local. It's something small. It's localized. What happens? It is sown, it sprouts, and it begins to grow and grow. And then, using the freedom that creativity affords, Jesus says, it spreads its branches to the end of the world. We know that no mustard tree does it. But here we are not doing a class in botany, but trying to understand something in spirituality, where symbolically speaking, these creative exaggerations are legitimate. Okay? So, the idea of seeking is that this small mustard seed, which was a limited local thing, becomes universal. And what is the proof that it has become universal? The proof is that the birds of the air will come and build their nest on the tree. Okay? That's it. That's the idea. Now, how can the birds build their nest if the mustard seed remains as a mustard seed? So the mustard seed is seeking. Now, you could well say to me, look here, the mustard seed is not seeking and growing in order that the birds may build their nests on the tree. That's all right. The point is, this mustard seed, like each one of us, and every tree, every grass, blade of grass in nature, everything exists in a beautifully interconnected world created by a loving, caring God. It's only after European consciousness cast out God from history that history became a domain of confusion. If you look at historical studies and historical pronouncements from, say, the 20th century onwards, actually from 18th century onwards, from the Enlightenment, but it's not very pronounced in the 18th century, but definitely it erupts by the time we come to the 20th century. Historians began to say, look, what's the point in studying history? After all, it's a domain of absurd, unconnected drift of events. They don't make any sense. Whereas in the old providential view of history, everything connected well together and made sense. So when we say seek as a spiritual duty, I said it's also there in philosophy, we mean accept for oneself the duty to understand everything, not in relation to some vested interest in the given context, not within some narrow framework that is prescribed for you, right? But in terms of what is ultimately valid. For example, an issue comes up, right? How should I, as a Christian thinker, respond to it? Take the case of this great anxiety about love jihad or narcotic jihad or whatever. How should I react to it? Should I look at it in terms of the narrow frame of reference, or should I look at it in terms of a much broader canvas of history? If I do the second, then I run the risk of being labeled disloyal. That's all right. What I'm saying is, I'm totally convinced that this is the discipline that Jesus has prescribed for us, and this is also a discipline that Jesus practiced. Otherwise, do you think Jesus will go into Samaria? Otherwise, do you think Jesus will go to Jerusalem in order to celebrate the feast of the Jews and then go, instead of going to the temple, go to Bethesda, which is nearby, where a community of invalids are waiting for some help? So Jesus' idea of celebration will include the people, the community of the excluded. The official framework will have no space for them. So in every given situation, you find the same principle at work. Now, this is what is called a paradigmatic issue. That is a fundamental issue. That's why I'm spending some time on this. If you can understand this issue, you can interpret very many events in the life of Jesus Christ and arrive at very stimulating insights and experiences. Now, try and do this for yourself. When an issue comes up, rather than accept the version put on it by X, Y, or Z, you try to investigate that particular episode, in terms of the factual details in as comprehensively as possible, a comprehensive factual study of a situation. Secondly, studying all of that within a framework of the teachings of Jesus Christ. Two concentric circles. And then you decide for yourself whether you can, in good conscience as a Christian, sing the same song that others are singing. I'm just leaving it as a suggestion. So, therefore, uh, I said so far that our perceptions, though they are extremely precious, our five senses are the only means we have to relate to the world, but they are very limited. There are gaps, huge gaps, and we have to be mindful of those gaps, and that's called humility. By the way, spiritual idea of humility is not bending backwards before men. Spiritual idea of humility is realizing that there are huge gaps in one's understanding of any given situation, understanding of the reality, understanding of the human predicament, understanding of the idea of the church or whatever, any given situation. And therefore, one need to seek beyond the given and the obvious so that we progress continually towards a more and more holistic or complete or full understanding of the situation. That is what makes us human. See, an animal also can understand a situation as it is. Like us, animals also will sense danger and run away, or it will attack if it can. But as compared to animals, the uniqueness of a human being is that we can not only see a situation as it is, but also understand a situation as it should be, which no other animal can. And that's precisely our duty. Till we begin to do that, we simply stay at the level of animals. Put very simply, we can say the most primary aim of spirituality is to enable us to rise higher than the level of animals. Okay? Well, think about it. So, we need to practice this discipline of connectedness. And that's why Jesus says, I have come that they may have life in all its fullness. Now, obviously, my palm is complete only when the five fingers cooperate, right? If my five fingers work in different directions independently, autonomously, then I can never be whole. I can never be complete. So, the reason why Jesus prescribed seeking as a fundamental spiritual duty is, and that answer is given not in that particular context, but in the 10th chapter of John's Gospel, chapter 10, verse 10, that they may have life in all its fullness. Now, this itself is a beautiful illustration of the duty to interconnect. In order to get the correct meaning of what Jesus says in the 5th chapter of Matthew's Gospel, you may have to connect it to the 10th chapter of John's Gospel. Okay? And if you want to take it further on, you may have to connect it to something else that he says in Luke's Gospel. And in some special context, you may have to connect it to something in the Old Testament, particularly the first book. And it goes on like that. And this is something that all of you are highly educated, you're intellectually capable. If you were to do this for yourself, I tell you, studying the Word of God becomes an unending experience of beautiful stimulation, inward richness. Otherwise, we hear the same stuff day in and day out, years together, and without our knowing it, a certain degree of frustration, what's called ENNUI, ENNUI, or fatigue, sermon fatigue, right? Convention fatigue sets in. Sunday service fatigue. I don't know if you have experienced Sunday service fatigue. I have. I have to be honest with you. Yes, I feel I experience it in almost every. Problem is maybe entirely mine, but I have to tell you that I experience it. So then, now let's go for a brief minute back to the beginning of the Bible. God creates Adam and Eve and places them in a garden. Okay? Places them in a garden. That garden is a symbol of this fullness. Garden is as a symbol. Now, I'm not saying literally it is, because there is something beyond the garden. Okay? But for if you imagine the predicament or the life situation of Adam and Eve, as God takes them, puts them in the center of the garden, for them, that's the fullness of everything. Their life is full. Okay? Now, why then is there this tree of the knowledge of good and evil, the forbidden tree? The temptation there is not so much knowledge. Actually, that is a false scent. The real temptation is that Adam and Eve are tempted by Satan. And this is the satanic element. If you want to understand Satan, I can't think of a better insight than this. The satanic element is always this, that the temptation to relate to everything only in part. Therefore, what Satan does in the scene of temptation in the 3rd chapter of the book of Genesis is to counterpoint the garden with the fruit. Right? So what will Adam and Eve choose? Will they choose the garden or will they choose the fruit? They choose the fruit. So already the pattern is embedded in the text. Human beings are forever tempted to make this mistake. We can justify it in all kinds of ways. For example, here, Satan provides a justification. What is justification? If you eat that fruit, you will become like God. Now, how stupid that notion is, we don't have to discuss. But then, very often, the way we tempt ourselves always involves high stupidities, deliberate stupidities, but that's subject for another day. So, wholesomeness is the garden of our life. If we want to really experience the sweetness of life, I'm very fond of that word, sweetness of life, we have to see our life as a garden. Garden is a metaphor or an image of unity in diversity, isn't it? Do you have a garden made only of the same flower or same fruit? No, there are many things. Life teems in a garden. In fact, beyond what we are aware of. So, we must think of our life, our individual life, our personality as a garden. And also at the same time realize that the perpetual temptation that sort of remains dangling before us is to only pick a small piece out of it, one item, stay obsessed to the exclusion of everything else. Okay, and this is something that I had to learn the bitter way, because see, I'm inclined to be a bit zealous, if you like, fanatical. I can't do anything in a half-hearted manner. If I do something, I must plunge into it. But through repeated mistakes, I learned one thing. When you become zealous, you also become blind. Why? Because you are zealous about only a small thing. You cannot be zealous about the universe, can you? Can you be zealous about the universe? Can you be zealous about a planet, this, or a star like the sun? No. You can only be zealous about small things. Have you noticed? Partial things. When you relate to higher things, you're not zealous. You are full of amazement and wonder. Right? That's why, you see, the psalmist says, the psalmist says, when I look at your handiwork, I'm full of amazement and wonder. Heavens declare the glory of God, the firmament is handiwork, right? Glory, glory. How that sense of awe and wonder rules out zeal. Very often people confuse the two things. You can never be zealous about the whole, because the whole is a domain of peace, of fulfillment. of, as I said, wonder and amazement. So, we have either knowingly or unknowingly exiled ourselves from the garden of life. If at the beginning of history, symbolically, Satan had to come and drag Adam and Eve out of the garden, today Satan can be at rest. We do it to ourselves. We have exiled ourselves from the garden of our own life, our own personality. That's the reason why every human being on planet Earth lives harboring a sense of inner unease, low self worth, some sense of smoldering resentment. The felicity of life is not there. And we try and cover it up in a variety of ways. After all, we know how much money there is in the entertainment industry, right? Then lots of money in the anesthetic industry. I'm not just talking about surgical anesthesia, but anything that keeps you below the level of consciousness, right? Consciousness is the greatest thing in a human being, but we are willing to do anything to escape consciousness, right? Alcoholism, for example, drug abuse, etc. What is it for? To somehow get rid of our consciousness. That's a kind of contradiction that we live in. Or another form is dependence. Mindless habitual dependence is as bad as drug addiction. Because dependence does exactly the same thing as addiction does in terms of fullness of life. So we are self-exiles from the garden of our own life. And therefore what happens? Today, human life is situated in the spiritual wilderness. I'll close on that because my time is coming to a close. Now, if you remember the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, the most unforgettable pronouncement or declaration by John the Baptist. What does he say? How does he describe himself? I am the voice crying in the wilderness, right? I am the voice crying in the wilderness. Where did Jesus go to fast and pray before the commencement of his public ministry? He went to the wilderness. Okay? And Exodus is all about a very long journey through the wilderness. Where are the 10 Commandments given? In the wilderness. Okay? These are all very profound things. So there are two symbols. One is the garden, the other is the wilderness. We can choose between the two. That freedom of choice is given to us. Jesus says, when he says that you may have life in all its fullness, Jesus is saying, for God's sake, choose the garden. Don't choose the wilderness. You know, in the book of Deuteronomy, I think it's chapter 19. I could be wrong. You can look this up. See, Moses leads the people almost there, right at the doorstep of the promised land. Moses climbs the mountain. He knows that he's not going to enter the promised land. And there, standing there, he addresses the people. And he says something extremely memorable. He says, this day I place before you the way of life and the way of death. Choose life. This day I place before you the way of life and the way of death. Then he says, choose life. That's the same as the words of Jesus, that they may have life in all its fullness. The point is, and I'm going to stop here right away, the point is that life can be had only in its fullness. Either we have life in its fullness or we have no life at all. What we have is mere existence. Existence. That's why the Bible says, in life, in the midst of life, we are in death. In the midst of, we don't have to breathe our last to be corpses, spiritual corpses. if you are short of this God-given benchmark of fullness, then we are in death. We are under the principle of death. So, this is an important aspect of spirituality, that it is the discipline of seeking the fullness of everything, which is not something that comes naturally to us. In fact, a broad generalization I can make is this, though making generalizations is a very bad habit and often spiritually, philosophically not tenable, I can still dare to make a generalization. In the meanwhile, I've forgotten the generalization. That's my problem. Okay, does it matter? What was the context I suddenly suffer these lapses. Never mind. So, this idea of fullness and the now I got the generalization. Generalization is this: whatever comes naturally to us by instinct, by impulse, etc., or whatever can be imbibed socially, need not be taught spiritually. Can you remember this much? In other words, the needs for spiritual education, spiritual training, spiritual enlightenment comes because these things cannot come naturally from human nature, nor can they be absorbed from the social context, even through education or social mores, etc. They have to be learned specially because they're paradigmatically different. Paradigmatically different. If anything is not clear, please let me know. I can explain. Because the problem with doing this kind of course is that as compared to my taking a class in a college classroom, where the parameters are all clearly set. There's a great deal that the students share with me. But we have come from different sources. We have made an abrupt beginning. So it's very likely that I'm not communicating some of these most important, particularly basic, important, essential, inevitable things clearly enough. If they're not grasped or understood and assimilated, then the forward journey could become a little more confusing. That's the reason why I'm very slow at this stage. At least if one session we can get used to one idea, one insight, I think that's good enough. And today, that's all that we have done. And upon that, I close for my part of the story. We can spend the next several minutes in discussions. By the way, I'm willing to stay back and handle your questions. But if anyone wants to leave, say, after 9 o'clock, please don't leave before 9 o'clock. Because we have agreed on 1 hour together. If you want to leave after 9 o'clock, it's fine. But if anybody wants to ask a question, I'm willing to stay back and spend time. Okay? Any questions?
Thank you, Achan, we didn't actually realize the 47 minutes running back so fast. I thought it was just 10 minutes or 15.
Yeah,
the whole thing.
That's because of the excitement all over the world.
The theme was packed seriously, and it was dense and thick, and hence it swept past like a mild breeze, a wind. Yeah. Now, the only question I have is this. You said that we need to seek, ask, and knock. And whatever thing that we have learned from things that don't naturally come to us, but outside the purview of the natural inflow into us, it has to be searched and researched and understood based on the whole teaching of Jesus. But don't you think it needs a lot of training, practice, and guidance? It's such a vast thing. How can the entirety of Lord's teaching can be boiled down to a small area of issue, small problematic issue? How do we make that paradigmatically different view?
And that's a very, very useful question, and I thank you for asking it. Now, it is not as difficult as it might seem. Perhaps I have made it more difficult than I should have, made it seem more difficult than it needs to be. Now, let's think very concretely. Think of the instance in which Jesus calls Simon and his brother Andrew. Okay? You find it in the first chapter of Mark's Gospel, verses 16, 17, 18. Now, Jesus tells them, follow me, and I will make you fishers of men. Now, what's the difference between being a fisher of fish and a fisher of men? Now, if you're a fisher of fish, all you need is a hook. You need only a small little tool. And also your goal is also limited. What's your goal? To find your livelihood. Okay, finding your livelihood is important. I'm not belittling it. But that's all. Your interest does not go beyond that. But you cannot deal with people like that. So what is involved there? I mean, it amazes me that Simon and his brother Andrew intuitively understood it. I don't think intellectually they understood it. What did they understand at that time? See, one of the beautiful things about the Gospels is that they are very, very economical. If you and I were to write an episode like this, we can write at least 20 pages on what is limited to 3 verses in the first chapter. Now, so we can try and understand this. Suddenly, Simon and his brother would have realized that here was a different world altogether. And what is the difference between the world in which they were laboring, struggling till then, and the new world which was ushered in, or which was being ushered in by Jesus? And that new world is the difference between living by the part and living by the whole. So in the presence and proximity of Jesus, they found a new universe of life. They would have felt, they would have intuitively felt it. So they would have realized that it was well worth their while to cast away their net and their boat, their only source of livelihood, and go after this man. Okay? So obviously it's a switch from something familiar to something unfamiliar. And what does the familiar world consist of? The familiar world comprises the strategy of taking life piecemeal, one thing at a time, one thing at a time. In Jesus, there's a fullness of everything. So when Jesus says, my grace is sufficient for you, we understand that in a mystical, magical sense. Like somebody casts a spell upon you, then you are saved. That's not the meaning of the grace of God. The grace of God is that you are given an entirely different perspective, and because of that, a different personality, a new creation, a second birth. You must be born again. See? Due to our first birth, which is physical, we are lodged in a situation where everything is taken piecemeal. In the new birth, we will take everything in its fullness. And that fullness means that every part is related to the whole. So that is the sense in which Jesus says, I and my Father are one. In that state, there is a sense of oneness with God. Now, this intuition exists in Hindu spiritual philosophy, attaining oneness with Brahma. What is the ultimate spiritual goal in Hinduism? That the burden of this separate existence and the suffering that goes with it, the existence in which the soul is trapped in the mortal coils, I'm just quoting their own words. the individual soul is entrapped in the mortal coil. It is then liberated from its separate existence and it becomes one with Brahma. What is Brahma?
Self-actualization.
What is Brahma? The totality of everything there is, isn't it? That's the idea of Tattvamasi, that thou art. Self. Now, in Hindu philosophy, if you ask the question, what is your self? The answer is that. You are not you, you are that. And what is that? That is Brahma. And therefore, you will realize your true self only when you become one with Brahma. That's the Hindu philosophy.
Tattvamasi, yeah.
Okay, that thou art. Okay, so that is the insight. And the biblical perspective is not very different. We may use different words. So when Jesus says, abide in me and I in you, the pattern is the same thing. Why should we abide in Jesus? What difference does it make to abide in him? The difference is that we shift our life from this foundation of the petty, puerile, the partial, our small little things, and we are relocated in the broad cosmic space of the divine authority, the divine being, the divine possibility. That is liberation. The liberation that Jesus came to provide is not material liberation, political liberation, economic liberation, though that's what we want. It's a liberation from our confinement to the small, suffocating cubicle of private, selfish existence into the kind of peace and freedom and fulfillment that arise out of being integrated with the whole, so that all forms of alienation, all forms of enmity, all forms of discontinuities are transcended and we become one with the Creator. That's the idea of abiding in God. How else would you abide in God? Tell me. Can we abide in God harboring our narrow little agendas, our parochialism, our small little infantile, puerile agendas? Can we really abide in God? See, we never confront these issues. That's a problem. We are never made to confront these realities. We are never allowed to look at the implications of what we read in the Bible. We gloss over. This verse is quoted, abide in me and I in you. How is that interpreted? I mean, we say, well, wine and the vineyard and the wine, and you will produce fruits. How will you produce fruits? What does it mean to produce fruits? What does it mean to abide in the vine and the branches? So, as against, there again, the pattern is the same, though the metaphors change. Think of the branch that is cut off. Okay? What happens? That branch will wither away and it's good only to be burnt, right? That's the text. What's the problem with the branch, the cut off branch? It's a small little thing. It has lost contact with the wholeness of life. If the branch is abiding in the vine, it is abiding not only in that particular plant, in the organic integrated vision of spirituality, which is the biblical vision. When the branch abides in the vine plant or tree, it is abiding in the whole universe. That vine tree or vine plant is in relationship with the distant sun, isn't it? It is part of the solar system, maybe the galaxy. It is in daily communion with the distant sea. Where does the wind come from that nourishes it? What do we know of the mysterious world, the subsoil world, where the plant stands, draws its sustenance from? What are the things going on all the time? Do we know? So that's why I'm saying that we have to de-school ourselves. We have to begin to think differently. The spiritual paradigm is very different from what we have been taught taught and talked about. Okay. I hope I've been able to offer some.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's very clear, Achan. Only one corollary question. You have underlined the word intuition and intellectuality.
Yeah.
Now, my question is, Prophet Muhammad is said to have been Gnostic. He would just behave to be in a trance, and then whatever he utters is from the Almighty God, and that becomes the law. That's kind of a Gnosticism. How can we differentiate between intuition, genuine intuition from the Holy Spirit, and this kind of Gnostic utterances condition?
To answer this question, I'll have to invoke the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, which I will do in greater detail later on. But for the time being, I'll only give a particular hint. The Spirit itself is a spirit of wholeness. That's why it cannot be controlled. Gospel of John, chapter 3, verses 7 and 8. The wind blows where it pleases. You do not know where it comes from, where it's going. So is the Spirit, right? That's the teaching of Jesus. Why is it that we cannot control the Spirit? Only one reason. The Spirit pertains to the whole. How can a small part control and contain the whole? That's what I'm saying. When people pretend that the Holy Spirit can be their ornament, poor souls, they don't understand what they're talking about. They're talking about some other kind of spirit, certainly not the Spirit that came upon Jesus. See, when Jesus emerged from the waters of Jordan, the Holy Spirit in the form of a dove, forget about the form now, or even the dove, comes from where? Comes from heaven, right? What does it mean? It means exactly what I said at the beginning. I said we need to provide connectivities, right? Did I say that? I said it very deliberately. So what is happening through the baptism of Jesus Christ is that two entities which were separated or alienated till then are now getting connected, right? And how connected? How? Not connected through a wire, but connected dynamically through movement. That is why whenever the Spirit is referred to in the teachings of Jesus Christ, the language used is always the language of dynamism. You will never see the terminology of statism, or the static, the inert state, or the material state, the solid state, in relation to the Spirit. Okay? Why? Because the Spirit belongs to the whole. Just as our breath. We think that our breath belongs to our lungs. No, our breath belongs to every cell in the body. Right? If we don't breathe, every cell will die, right?
Yes.
Same thing. So the breath, in fact, much of the aid to learning spiritual things is already in our body, in our being. If only we would understand ourselves. See, all knowledge is ultimately, or Greek said, all knowledge ultimately is self-knowledge. Right? And the only real thing is everything. Can you remember this? Okay? The only real thing, let me also put it this way, the only real self is humanity. Who am I? Humanity, ultimately humanity. I may carry this label, that label, but these labels are accidental. George is also humanity. Okay? So, the self, the only real self is humanity. The only real thing is everything. Therefore, all these notions of, distinct things, separate things, my things, your things, my church, your church, right? All this is an illusion. And we need to outgrow this illusion. That's what I have learned from the teachings of Jesus Christ, and we can continue to discuss it. I'm sure that you will continue to mull over these things over the coming 6 days. So when we come back together again, you may have more questions to ask. And your questions will make me think more and more. And that process, that way we can grow together. And that's what I'm looking forward to. Okay?
Thank you.
Any further question? Anything else?
So there are some questions in the
Yes.
chat.
Questions in
the chat box.
Oh, chat. Okay. All right. What does it say? Abraham Koshi. Good evening. Yes, good evening. Yeah. Good evening from London. What is the discipline required for seeking? Well, that's something with which I started actually. The first and most basic discipline is the willingness to be open in the mind. Because you cannot seek with a closed mind, right? Just as you can't pour water into an inverted bucket. Okay? So keep your minds open. Now, to give an illustration from the Bible, the Jews were seeking a Messiah. And they have been doing so for centuries. When finally the Messiah came, what happened? What happened? They cast him out, right? John chapter 1, verses 11 and 12. He came to his own received him not, but to all who received him and believed in his name, to them he gave the right to be the children of God, right? So the Jews were waiting for the Messiah, but with a closed mind. How do we close our minds? We don't close our minds like closing our eyes. We close our minds by harboring presuppositions. For example, we have presuppositions about how God should work. Though we say God's ways are mysterious. We do both at the same time. God's ways are mysterious, but he must do exactly in this manner, right? We do that. Stereotype. We have a stereotype, we have a presupposition about who a pious person is. And Jesus continuously questions it. We have a presupposition about what practices are important, what traditions are absolutely essential. These are all things that make us blind, make us closed in our minds. So the first thing we have to do is to be open in the mind. The second thing, being open in the mind will remain merely academic, theoretical, if there is no willingness to change. Yes, I'm open in the mind. I'm willing to listen to you. Yes. But when I go back, I'm back to square one. Then in that case, I'm not seeking, I'm merely making a pretense of seeking. Third, to seek, one must realize, and this is also very fundamental, one must realize that there are serious problems with one's predicament as of now. Now, if you think that you are in heaven, everything is perfect, everything is hunky-dory, why seek? And this is what is called complacency. So we have to cast out complacency in order to acquire the willingness to, or in order to experience the need to seek, And finally, we must also have hope. Hope that seeking will lead us somewhere. If seeking is a bus ride to nowhere, no one will do it. And that hope is validated in Jesus Christ. That's where Jesus comes in. If we seek, then Jesus is our fellow traveler. You think of the road to Emmaus, Two disciples, terrified, defeated, frustrated, running away from Jerusalem to Emmaus. Somebody joins them. That is a guarantee that in this sort of beleaguered world or beleaguered existence in a broken world, our seeking will take us somewhere. Believe you me, that is the truth. But in doing so, we should not have again fixed notions. If I seek, I must reach there. It's not like taking a ticket to New York. Spiritual seeking is like boarding a flight that you do not know goes where, but you only know that it will go somewhere, and that somewhere will be an experience of tremendous fulfillment, great meaning, and great happiness. But in all of this, now I come to the most important part with which I'll conclude this part of the discussion. In all of this, my friends, the most decisive thing is this: unless and until we develop a passion to develop ourselves, we will never seek. See, the problem with us is that we are very cruel and unkind to ourselves. I don't know how many of you realize this. We are so unfair and so unkind to ourselves. And we try to justify this under the garb of humility. If you don't want to seek, all that you have to do is to say, well, I'm a donkey, I'm stupid. There's no good in me. If you're rubbish, why seek? This is the first thing we have to cast out. This is where the mind plays its game with us and prevents us from seeking. Never mind who you are, never mind where you are. If you seek, you will find. No question about it. Absolutely certain. The question is, do you want to seek? Or do you want to wallow in self-pity? This is what people do. People who do not seek always pity themselves. Oh, I have a raw deal in life. Oh, nobody cares for me. Oh, nobody takes me seriously. Oh, everybody ignores me. Life lived in unending resentment, a kind of self-destructive self-denigration resulting in low self-worth and a nagging sense of underprivilege. We don't have to be like this at all. Never mind who you are. You don't have to be like this. That is my experience. That's what life has taught me. That's my experience of faith. I've written about my life. If you read it, you will realize it's incredible what can happen. And I don't think God is partial to anyone. Acts of the Apostles, chapter 10, 11, God is not partial, right? It can happen to anyone, provided you're willing to seek. Okay? Does that make sense to you, Anne? Your question is, I was dealing with your question, no?
No, it was not my question. It was Abraham Koshi's
Abraham,
question.
I'm so sorry. Yes, sorry. See, when you're 72 and counting, this happens, right? Okay. Yes, any further question? I make it 9:40. Yes, please. Can I see you, please? Joseph Woman, right? Yeah.
It's about last week's session that I'm asking.
Yes, Joseph.
Is it possible to consider religion and spirituality as mutually exclusive? Mutually exclusive in the sense that one can be spiritual without being religious and vice versa.
See, the problem in this kind of question is that we are actually trying to compare two dynamic entities which are constantly changing. Now, for example, what do we mean by religion? Now, in my most recent publication titled Beyond Religion, I say that every religion is at its purest closer to its origin. Like the Ganga is purest at Gangotri. I still remember that is exactly the sentence I wrote in that book. Where is Ganga? Ganga becomes very polluted, no? But if you go to Gangotri, it's very pristine, pure. As it flows down and away from its source, what happens? It gathers all kinds of dirt. This happens in religion. So if you actually see religion closer to its fountain spring, say, for example, the life of the early church, house churches. There were no organized churches like what we have today, the house churches with only elders, no priest, no bishop, no archbishop, no cardinal, only elders. And the Acts of the Apostles say they devoted themselves daily to the teachings of the apostles, daily. So here is a community that is keen to learn. Here is a community that is willing to share. Here is a community that is willing to suffer for its faith. Here is a community that's willing to prioritize matters of faith over and above everything else in the world. So that is what happens when a religious tradition is still close to its spiritual roots. But over the years, as it flows away, it gathers a lot of historical dirt. And ultimately, as Paul Tillich writes, I think the title of the book is Christ and Culture or something like that. So towards the theology of culture. He says, a time will come due to this process. It was he who alerted me to this, frankly, I must acknowledge. He says, a time will come when religion will become a contradiction of spirituality. And he also, I think in that context, refers, I read this book maybe 40 years ago, it makes a reference to the crucifixion of Jesus Christ. Who crucified Jesus? The custodian of religion, right? So such is the murderous misunderstanding of religious custodians at that time, that they think that they're doing God a great justice or great service, great favor by killing Jesus. After all, the high priest Caiaphas conspired to kill Jesus, not because Jesus was threatening to steal his chicken, but because he thought that he, as the high priest, should defend God from Jesus. We still do that, no? We are all, many people are busy trying to save God from Muslims, from Marxists, from this person, that person, right? And in this process, we think, cultivating political patronage will help. All that's going on. I don't have to go into details. So at that stage, religion can become a contradiction of spirituality. And that is the reason why there is a need to continually renew a spiritual tradition. Renewal is as important for churches as it is for individuals, because renewal is the very principle on which life is built. Whatever is dynamic has to be renewed. Okay? So whatever is not renewed continually, not even once in a while, continually, will become over a period of time its contradiction. For example, if a human being sits still in one place for, say, 6 months, he will die. Why? Because toxicity will gather. Our body is being continuously renewed. And that renewal is incorporated into the dynamism of the body. So when we relapse into the static stage, we disrupt that inner process of ongoing renewal and jeopardize life itself. The same is true about religion. Okay? Anything else?
So I have a question.
Yes, yes.
So we've been speaking a lot about seeking. Where and to whom should we seek? Where should we seek from?
See, seeking is not a matter of a particular space or a context. Seeking is a matter of personality. The idea is to become a seeking person, so that no matter what you do, what you handle, where you are, you have a seeking relationship. As I said, seeking also involves developing an attitude of wonder and amazement, right? This belittling or ridiculing attitude will not be compatible with seeking. So the idea is to become seeking beings rather than turning seeking into some kind of special occasional activities. And you will never sustain it unless and until we become seeking. In fact, in spirituality, there's no difference between seeking and seeker. The seeker is also seeking. So in that context, that is actually the mysticism in the personality or person of Jesus that everybody sensed. Remember when Jesus taught, people said they were amazed. That's how Sermon on the Mount ends. They were amazed because he did not teach like the Pharisees and Sadducees. He taught them with authority. What is that authority? Authority is the personality itself, the person of Jesus. Now then, Jesus is also given to us as the benchmark for us to emulate. Jesus says, be imitators of me, right? So it is the personality of Jesus that we are exhorted to emulate. And then that particular reorientation of life, that's what Jesus says to Nicodemus, you must be born again. That will then take care of everything. Okay? Otherwise, if you decide, no, from tomorrow onwards, I'm going to seek, it's not going to last even for two hours. Okay? You think more about it. If you have further questions, we can deal with it. Okay?
Yes, sir.
I mean, for you, this kind of thing must be very fascinating because it's right at the heart of the special kind of work that you've committed yourself to doing. Creativity is very much involved here. What is creativity ultimately? It's a kind of profound seeking, no? Why does a person write? Why does a person draw? Why does a person create an object of beauty, a sculptor, for example? Why does someone spend 10 hours drawing on the walls of the Sistine Chapel, the Last Supper? It's about 10 years. Why does one do it? No, amazing. Yeah. Anything else? If there are no further questions, we can. From this week onwards, I need to ask you. You see, a question was raised whether we can edit the question answer out of what is posted, so that the question answer session can be very, very free and uninhibited. I'm in favor of it. But the only thing is this, when I consulted my brother-in-law and my sister, they feel that the question answer session also generates some insights. John is there. John, this is the issue that you raised with me, and I fully understand what you're saying, and I'm in full sympathy, because it takes away that spontaneous freedom, which is very essential to ask certain types of questions. We're all human beings, I understand that. But
I understand.
Yeah. No, therefore,
Yes,
we can have
I
a discussion.
understand that. I mean, what is actually... Yes.
Yeah.
Pardon?
So what I can do is I can be a little more discreet in dealing with questions, if that helps. So there are now two options before us. One is, before posting the video on YouTube, edit the Q&A out of it, which means that the film, the video will be only 45 minutes, 40 to 45 minutes. And the remaining goes.
Sir, I don't think you need to do that for all the sessions, because only in certain sessions, like last time we went into very sensitive issues. That's why I thought.
Then what I suggest is, I could give you my brother-in-law's number. He's the one who does everything. I don't handle any of these things. He'll be very happy to liaise with you. You can actually guide him.
No,
You
it's
can
all
guide
right.
him. Yeah.
We just go ahead with as we're doing now.
Okay.
I would just wanted to, I came on because I wanted to just share some also as we were
Yes.
about the fullness.
Yeah. Sure. Join your line. Your line is not particularly clear.
Oh,
Yeah,
is it?
your voice is
Then
garbled.
I will not talk today because, then in that case, I will not talk today because
It's better now.
is,
It is better. It is better. It is better now. It is better.
Okay.
Now.
Okay, fine. In the wholeness and fullness of life, which you mentioned, the worldly way of looking at it is where we see people actually manifesting overtly certain behaviors.
Yes.
Yeah. They think that is the fullness of life.
Yeah.
Very often what happens is that what I just want to add you were saying, actually, not contradicting what you're saying.
Yeah.
It's just that there are certain things that people from overtly doing things, or maybe there could be others who stop a person from, being the full potential. But then within the self, the things, the thought processes, as you said about the renewing in spirituality that takes place, that in itself is wholeness, because you are seeing the intuitive connections between different things.
Absolutely. Yes. Yes. Yeah, I fully agree with you. I think
I
that's a
just
very
add
valid.
to whatever you have said.
Yeah, that's a very valid insight. Complementary things like this would help everybody in the group. So it is not that, you see, at any point in time we finally arrive. The thing is, and that's the beauty of life, we are always in process. That's why we always imagine life as a journey. The unhealthy state is the state of being stuck in one place and the refusal to take one step forward. That's where we begin to die. So death is the state of stagnation which excludes seeking and growing, as we have been trying to understand. So the idea of being alive is something, or the state of being alive is something that needs to be daily celebrated, not in the usual carnival sense, but in the sense of the individual knowing within himself, herself, that yes, by the grace of God, I am on the move, right? I may not be turning the mountains upside down, or I may not be producing a great harvest, but I am oriented in that direction. And therefore, I will not sort of in any way condone, supplement, reinforce, endorse, justify the advocacies of the partial. Because the partial is an aberration. Now, for example, let me give you an illustration. Because of your psychological background, this is appropriate. Now, imagine you're sitting in your room, say your bedroom. Your door is open in part. Say both flaps of the door are apart by 6 inches or say 3 inches. All right? You can see only that much. Your favorite cat. Do you have a cat at home? You don't know. You have a dog at home? Okay. Well, let's assume that Joan has a beautiful cat at home. The cat is walking. So what do you see? You first see the head. So there is a head going. Now suppose Joan hasn't seen a cat before. this is purely hypothetical, because if you have a pet cat, you have seen it before, but hypothetical. What will you think of the cat? You'll see that the cat is only a head. Okay? So then, as you watch, the cat is moving further. Then what do you see? You see two legs. In the meanwhile, the head has gone out. So now you will say the cat is only two legs. Okay? But it's still moving. Then you see two more legs. Okay? Then you see a tail. So depending on at which stage you catch glimpse of the moving cat, your idea of the cat will be grotesque. This is a problem with, I'm now inventing a word. This word doesn't exist in English. Partness. This is the problem with partness. On the analogy of wholeness. I don't know why a language which has a word like wholeness doesn't have a word like partness. So we have to invent that word. So this is a simple analogy to demonstrate the very gross aberrations there always are in partners. That is why in the 13th chapter of Paul's first letter to Corinthians, I can't give you the exact verse, but it's certainly somewhere between verse 10 and 14. He says, now we see in part, right? When the whole comes, the part will go away, he says. Now we see in part as like in a mirror. But when the fullness of things come, the part will go away. That's our liberation. When the part goes away, or our imprisonment in the partial goes away, that's our liberation. That's when we become a new creation. That's a moment of transformation. That's the experience of being born again. Okay? So that's precisely what I have been trying to, and I want to thank you profusely for making me explain it a little better. I think I'm also clearer now, to tell you the truth, because of the analogy that came into my mind. Often abstract concepts become a lot better, clearer, when we connect it to something concrete. Right? So I want to thank, on behalf of all my friends sitting there, I want to thank you for your cat. Okay? Suresh, you haven't said a word, my friend.
I think tomorrow there is a Sunday service, so that's...
Okay, yes, that's right. You don't want to become a scatterbrain, right? Okay, yes, absolutely. Yes, you see, there is a poet, an English poet called Robert Browning. Now, Robert Browning was very obscure. So critics had a lot of difficulty in trying to decipher, find out what he actually meant. So a man had an accident and he was admitted to a hospital. He was recuperating. And his doctor, being very kind, thought he should read something. And he gave him Browning's poems. So he opened one of the poems and started reading. Then he started crying. The doctor came back and said, "What's the problem?" He says, "I've lost my brain completely. I lost it, you see." So I don't want you to suffer that kind of handicap.
In any case, the whole session was very heavy. Now it has become light. Okay.
Okay. Then I'll give you one more episode from the life of Browning. He wrote, I think, Rabbi Ben Ezra or something. So a critic asked him, "Sir, what does your poem mean?" So he said, "Look, when I wrote the poem, only two people knew the meaning. God and me. Now only the former knows." So you must know that these things exist. So I'm not the worst exposure you can have. Okay. So on that we close, and I want to thank all of you for joining and staying on till the end. Thank you. And if you happen to know people who might benefit from this experience, feel free to invite them. After all, people can leave when they want, but let them taste something for themselves and see if it helps in any way. Okay. All right. So that's the idea of being fishers of men, right? Fishers of men. Okay. Thank you very much. God bless. Until we meet again, all that's good and beautiful, may they come your way. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Achan. Thank you very much.
Goodbye. Thank you
you.
so much.
Good night.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.